So now recording. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate you for signing up, for taking time out of for many of you, it's your lunch hour, taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar on cybersecurity. We're excited to have you. We're also excited to have today's presenter. Before I introduce him, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Caleb Telley. I'm the Director of Marketing and Events at Startup Junkie. For those of you who may not be familiar with Startup Junkie, we are based in Northwest Arkansas. We are a mission-driven organization that exists to empower innovators and entrepreneurs. And we do that largely in two ways. And one is through one-on-one consulting with entrepreneurs and small business owners, anywhere from ideation to $25 million in revenue at absolutely no cost. And then the other way is through events, which of course are now mostly webinars, to provide education, resources, connections, networking, all sorts of things, which are all, of course, also completely free to entrepreneurs. And so today's presenter is Alex Palmer with TeleComp. Alex is the manager of cybersecurity and managed services at TeleComp. He's an IT professional with over 6 years experience focusing on delivering cybersecurity and IT solutions to small and medium-sized businesses in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the South Central region. He is a Sophos certified engineer and cloud security provider, and that we're excited to hear what he's got to tell us today in the webinar. If you have a question at any point during today's webinar, I encourage you to go ahead and drop it in the chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook, add it to the comment section on Facebook, and that way we can address those questions at the end of the webinar. They'll also have an opportunity to unmute at the end to ask your questions as well if you'd like to go that route. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alex.
Thank you, Caleb, and I appreciate everyone joining today so we can go through this. So we're talking about cybersecurity in 2021 and beyond. So a little bit about me. Caleb did my intro, but I am Alex Palmer. I'm the manager of cybersecurity and managed services here at TeleComp. I've been in the field for a little over 6 years, and in my role here at TeleComp, I really focus on cybersecurity for small and medium-sized businesses in Arkansas and Oklahoma. A little bit about TeleComp. We're a full-service IT service provider based out of Rogers, Arkansas, but we have offices all throughout Oklahoma, Arkansas, and a few in Texas as well. So with that, let's just jump right into it. So a little bit about the history of cyber threats. You know, where did we start and kind of where we are today? So, you know, early on, malware and cyber attacks were mostly, you know, acts of cyber vandalism. You know, people going to websites or systems and just breaking into them because they could. Mostly as kind of a chip on the shoulder or bragging rights to say, hey, look, you know, I can get in here, you know, when I shouldn't be, that sort of thing. In the 2000s, and so that you know, it moved into more destruction. You know, maybe a virus that once it gets on your computer, it just makes unusable. You know, you might have to replace your computer or reload the operating system or something like that. But, you know, typically it didn't have a financial motivation, and it was usually limited in reach and scope. Usually it was, if your computer got it, then it was just your computer. We didn't see that spread start happening until the mid to late 2000s. And that's when cyber threats, they really started to evolve, not just in their sophistication, but their scope and aim as well. So, you know, that it moved on from, you know, single individuals just breaking into something because they could, and moved to a targeted, coordinated effort between really high level professionals seeking you know, a financial benefit for their actions. And that's mostly where we still find ourselves today. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all the threats that are out there, but these are kind of the four big ones that I wanted to talk about that really have an impact on businesses. It's something that we see out in the field all the time. So we've got, our ransomware, we've got banking Trojans, supply chain attacks, and social engineering. And we'll go into each one of those as well. And, a lot of times these are interwoven together as well. So ransomware. It's probably something that everyone here has heard about and, you've seen on the news or, I hope not, but probably many of you have been in an organization that was hit by ransomware. So let me take just a second to define what ransomware is and what it does. Basically, it's a virus that can get into computer networks that looks for certain types of files, things, high value data, and it locks those files and encrypts them. And then it will typically demand a ransom for you to unlock those files, given the name. The information that you're seeing on this slide here, this came from a 2019 survey done by Sophos networks of about 10,000 IT managers in small to medium-sized businesses. Over half of those organizations were hit with ransomware in the last year, and a lot of those were hit twice on average. And that's something that not a lot of organizations are prepared for, is that if they can get in once, typically they can get back in again, maybe through the same way that they originally got in, or ransomware is notorious for, once it gets in, it creates 10, 15, 20 different back doors to get back out. And so, maybe you plugged up 10 of them, but there's still 5 that they can get out on, and they'll wait and then they'll hit you again. Now, 77% of those businesses that were hit were running up-to-date antivirus at the time of the attack. And, going into, okay, well, if they had, up-to-date AV and they were still hit, what can we do? We'll kind of cross that a little later on. And the median financial impact for those that were surveyed was around $133,000. So, I mean, it's no small potatoes. That's not an insignificant amount of money to basically any business. And that's not just, that's just the financial impact. There's much greater impacts that can happen from ransomware. So we're going to do a bit of a case study on one specific type of malware that really made the news back a few years ago, and that's the Wannacry ransomware. So Wannacry, it's a ransomware that covertly encrypts files, preventing you from accessing it and demanding a ransom. Now, what kind of made Wannacry a bigger deal than what other ransomware had been was that it also included components in it that could move throughout your network. And those are called worms. A worm is any sort of virus that can go from one system to another and move across your network. So there was a vulnerability that was discovered, and this worm exploited that. And it was extremely destructive. It was extremely widespread. Some of you may remember that the National Health Services, which runs all of the healthcare in the UK, was severely affected by this, and they were unable to access their systems for days and some systems for weeks after this attack. The screenshot that you see here, that is the Wannacry. That's what you'll see. And, too many times, saw this, you can say, you can see here, and it's kind of scary. Your payment will be raised, your files will be lost. How do I pay? The one good thing about Wannacry is that typically it was asking for about $300, which isn't so bad, but there's no guarantee that you actually get that. It's about a 50-50 shot, even if you pay the ransom, that you would get it back. So Wannacry started, really came into effect in May of 2017. That's when it started to hit. That's when the NHS in the UK really started to see this start to devastate their networks. So it was using in a vulnerability to spread inside the networks. Now, that vulnerability was discovered and patched by Microsoft in March. So that was, the vulnerability was discovered in March and the attack happened in May. So that was just 2 months. There are a lot of systems out there that they might not get patched every 2 months. If you're 3, 4, 6 months behind on your patching, that just goes to show how fast those vulnerabilities can be taken advantage of. And the exploit that they used was known as Eternal Blue, and that exploit was actually released in April, and it was a leak of National Security Agency tools. So it was very powerful. I mean, it was made by the NSA, people that really know what they're doing, and that's part of why it was so destructive. And I want to cover vulnerabilities and exploits here real quick. So a vulnerability is something that could be a problem, right? So let's think of it like this. One of your house's vulnerabilities is its windows, right? Because you have windows are vulnerable to attacks. So that's a vulnerability. Now, an exploit would be something like taking a rock and smashing your window. That's an exploit, right? So there's lots of vulnerabilities out there. There's not always a way to take advantage of them, but that's what we're talking about when we say, a vulnerability and an exploit. So what happened to people that got hit with this? Files with this specific extensions were encrypted. So it was a lot of databases, Word documents, and backup files were really the ones targeted. It's not just gets onto your computer and just infects everything that it can find. It's smarter than that. It was more targeted. It knew what kind of high value information would look like based on file types, and it specifically targeted those. Now the victims would see a message asking for a ransom, and then that ransom would be doubled after 3 days. And then after 7 days, the files would all be deleted. And that creates that sense of urgency where people maybe start acting out of fear or emotion, and that we've got to get this done. We've got to, we really have to move fast on this. And that sense of urgency is a common tactic, not within just ransomware, but within all manner of cybersecurity threats, especially social engineering, which we'll cover as well. And as I mentioned before, the ransomware installed backdoors to access the systems remotely, even after they were already in, so that they had another way in. And what they used was double pulsar, which was also a part of the NSA toolset leak itself. Now, luckily, Wannacry is over. What was found by security researchers was that there was a kill switch embedded into the code for Wannacry. And basically what it was doing is it was looking to see if a website existed. If that website existed, it would stop running. Now, why exactly that was put in, we're not really sure, but it was found by security researchers, and that website was registered, which significantly helped stop the spread of it. But There are organizations that use proxies or web filters that might not let them connect to that website, and the malware wouldn't have known that it could get out to it, and would have still run. There was also some registry entries, which is like, it's kind of like the library of your computer. So it kind of keeps the records of everything. And there was, there was a setting that could be put in there to prevent that. So, future versions of it, removed the kill switch and changed the name of the registry entry. We don't see Wannacry as active anymore, but it was very destructive for the time being, and really made some splashes. So that's where I wanted to, that I really want us to focus on that, and what all happened with that. And there are thousands and thousands of different strains of ransomware that work in much the same way. I can't see any of the questions. So Caleb, do we have any questions about ransomware before I move on to a next section?
No questions yet, but if you do have a question, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll address them.
Perfect. Okay. So now we're going to move on to baking Trojans. And this is a much less known type of malware, but it is just as destructive, if not more destructive, than a lot of them. So banking Trojans is malware that infects your computer to steal sensitive information. Specifically, it looks to steal banking and personal information, generally for the purposes of committing identity fraud, things like that. Some of these also just collect that information and then sell it to other criminal organizations. It can cost up to $1 million to remediate some strains of this. A lot of it we see comes in through email attachments. And what makes it particularly scary is that it can sit dormant for long periods of time. I mean, weeks, months. The longest that I've ever seen in person of a banking Trojan sitting on a system before it was discovered was over 200 days. So, imagine that it's sitting there for 200 days collecting information. What kind of info do these collect? And it can be very devastating. Specifically, we're going to talk about the most devastating, which is Emotet. And it is still going on today. It was first discovered back in 2014, so we've had 7 years.
Sorry about that.
I realized I was yeah, sorry about that. I was muted there. So let's go back. So banking Trojans. So it's malware that infects your computer and steals information. Now, it specifically looks to steal banking and personal information, typically for the purposes of identity fraud, financial fraud, things like that. It can cost up to $1 million to remediate some strains of this, and that's the strain we'll talk about here in a minute. Typically, we see these come in through email attachments as well, and it can sit dormant for long periods of time. And that's what's really scary about these kinds of banking Trojans, is that they can sit on your computer, not really doing anything, but collecting information for weeks, months. The longest I've ever seen personally is 214 days, where there was a banking Trojan on a computer that before it was discovered. And just imagine how much information it can collect in that amount of time. So we're going to talk about Emotet. It is the most devastating form of these banking Trojans and the most effective. It was first identified back in 2014, and it is still going today. It's been over 7 years of this one strain of malware that is really devastating. a lot of companies, a lot of people personally as well, stealing money from them, things like that. So originally it was designed just to be a banking Trojan that just snuck onto your computer and stole sensitive information like your online banking logins, things like that. Any sort of personally identifiable information that they could kind of tie back to you to try and commit identity fraud. Now, later versions of this has seen Emotet as kind of a jumping off point where it will install not just itself and its own malware and what it's trying to do, but it'll install other malware, other banking Trojans. It can be used to facilitate ransomware after they've sat on your system and stolen all the information they want. They'll put some ransomware in there on a timer, and 3 months later, after they've gone and patched up all their holes and hidden how they did everything, 6 months later you get hit with ransomware or something like that. So what happens with Emotet? So it has functionality that helps it be extremely evasive against anti-malware products. And it has the worm-like capabilities that we talked about with Wannacry as well, where it can look throughout computer networks and see if any of them are vulnerable to it as well, and then attack those and go to it. Now, it uses a number of tricks to avoid that. It can tell if it's running inside a virtual machine, which is a type of server, and it can lay dormant if it detects that it's being analyzed, or if it's in a sandbox, which would be typical tools to try and figure out if there's something malicious about this certain file or not. So luckily, or strangely rather, when COVID first started to kind of hit back in January, February of 2020, there was this huge drop off in attacks, and it really, nobody could really understand why. But back last July, it started coming back in big waves. So, with this latest wave, typically what we're seeing is malicious emails that contain a URL or an attachment that once you go to the website or open the attachment, it launches Emotet. And because there's nothing really obvious when that happens, a user might go to that website or open that document and nothing really happens, and they might not report that. They might just think, well, that's weird. Something's weird about that. I'll just ignore it and move on. And that's what we see a lot. One of the most popular techniques is for a document to be sent as a reply within an existing email thread. So, let's say you're emailing with somebody back and forth, and you've got that replied message thread, and then in that they send you a message that has an attachment, and this is what that looks like. So you'll see there'll be an attachment, and you'll open it up, and it will say something like, you're not able to do this because it was created on an iOS device. Click, enable content. Now, I like to think that, that's not, that users might know, don't enable content, don't enable macros on things that you aren't 100% sure about. But think about it in the context of a person working. Let's say maybe it's 4:45 and they get this reply from somebody that they trust. It's a legitimate email address, someone that they regularly contact with, and it's, please see this attachment. Okay, it's near the end of the day. I'm trying to get out of here. Okay, let me look this up. What's this warning? Click enable content. Okay, they click it, right? I mean, that sort of thing can happen to almost any business, unless your users are really well trained and they're up to date on these sorts of things. it's very easy to slip by. And this is just one of the ways that Emotet does it, but it is a very effective way to do it. So the current state of Emotet, like I said, we're still dealing with this in 2021, Bleeping Computers is reporting that they're using actually stolen email attachments and stolen email address books to add legitimacy and to have a higher success rate with their targeting. It's used as the entry point for a lot of other attacks. Like I said earlier, that dwell time can last days or weeks. It's dropping secondary payloads, so that's other malware throughout your system everywhere it goes. And it's been observed dropping payloads such as TrickBot and QuackBot. Those are things that are mainly meant to steal credentials, but it can be the precursor to ransomware. So, part of what makes ransomware so effective is that usually it steals your credentials and starts elevating until it has the highest level privileges that it can. And one way it can do that is by using, malware such as TrickBot and other things to steal credentials. So now this is supply chain attacks, and this is something that has been getting a lot more attention lately due to the SolarWinds Orion breach, and we'll talk about that more in depth here. But basically, supply chain attacks are meant to try and compromise the software supply chain. So when you're using some sort of software as a service or based application, or even just a regular application that you download on your computer, typically, if it's from a reputable vendor, you don't question that. Updates come in usually automatically. You don't even know about that. But that's where these attacks come in. They want to put malware into otherwise legitimate applications. They're extremely difficult to detect because of that, because they operate inside of and under the guise of legitimate applications. And because that's very difficult to do, there's usually a high value target focus to them, as well as the resources behind them are usually nation state actors, as we've seen recently. So the biggest one that you might have heard about lately is the SolarWinds Orion breach. So SolarWinds is a very, very well-known networking company. They provide all sorts of tools in the IT industry, and Orion specifically was a product around managing networks, network observability. Now, what that meant is that this product basically had eyes and kind of feelers into most parts of a network, and went kind of everywhere. So FireEye, which is a security research company and a security services vendor, we're actually the ones to discover this. SolarWinds did not discover this. It was by a third party. And they saw that they were Trojanizing the software to distribute a malware that's, they've called Sunburst. After they were able to get in, they were using highly sophisticated techniques to avoid detection and obscure their activity. And the campaign is absolutely widespread. I mean, the scope of this attack is still not really well known because of how many people were using this, how hard it is to detect, and how hard it is to remediate. So basically how it works is after an initial period of dormancy, it retrieves and executes jobs from the attacker's servers. And that can do things like transfer files, execute files, look at your system, reboot machines, disable services, do a lot of stuff, basically have, a lot of control within the network. And it masqueraded itself, as legitimate network traffic within the Orion Improvement Program, which was basically the telemetry that SolarWinds used to improve their product. So, every application that you have installed basically collects information about how you use it, what you're doing, and then sends that to the developer to, presumably make fixes, improvements, feature updates, that sort of thing. But in this case, the attackers were able to infiltrate that, to spread around networks. Now, it used a lot of different block lists and different techniques to avoid forensics and AV tools running on the computers. Now, this was kind of the first, update. There was a Senate hearing about this, actually, because of how that a lot of government agencies, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Homeland Security, basically you name it, federal agencies use this product. So there's a big committee hearing about it, with SolarWinds, Microsoft, FireEye, and CrowdStrike executives. And they basically all kind of pointed towards Russia as the source of the attacks. And that's not surprising for many of us because of the scale and sophistication. It pretty much had to be a nation state type of actor that would do this. And because of that, the US government's now preparing sanctions to put against, not just for SolarWinds, but for other things as well. There was also a new, back on February 26th, just 2 weeks ago, there was another hearing about this. There's been multiple hearings. Now there's a new hearing. Basically, they're trying to figure out, why it happened and what can be done to prevent it, and who needs to be punished for it. But this is very much in the ongoing phase right now. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is that just because it was SolarWinds this time doesn't mean that it couldn't be a product that you're using as well in the future. So when you're, as a business, when you're trying to evaluate, what kind of programs to use and things like that, you also want to, look at the history of that company, see their track record about cybersecurity and things like that, and how do they secure everything. I do see a question came in. Do we see supply chain attacks for Linux-based systems as well? We absolutely do. Now, Orion itself was a Windows program, but the back-end build infrastructure and things like that was probably almost certainly Linux. And at some point in there, they were able to compromise it. Most web applications, SaaS programs have Linux somewhere in the back end, and it is always a piece. It's always something that's looking to be compromised. Now, on the desktop side, going around things like that, Linux isn't, it's just not used in desktops really. So attackers don't put that much effort into it, but on the server side, absolutely. So that was a great question. And finally, we're going to talk about social engineering. So what is social engineering? It's the quote unquote hacking of humans, basically using deception, psychology, and reconnaissance to try and get information from people, launch different kinds of attacks. We've seen it used to manipulate employees to transfer money, buy gift cards, let people have access to their computers when they shouldn't have. And social itself is not really an attack, but it is so widely used to start other attacks. I wanted to talk about this. So I've got a couple examples here of what you might see as a phishing attack. And I wanted to highlight this email as well. Back in the day, not even that long ago, 3-4 years ago, you could expect these sorts of emails to, look kind of clunky, look kind of junky, be riddled with spelling errors and things like that. But not anymore. I mean, they can come through and look extremely legitimate. You've got Bank of America up there, and then you'll see the actual in the brackets there is no reply at isp.org. When you're on mobile, you don't see that end piece. You just see the display name, Bank of America. And when you see that and it's got the logo and this all seems right, it's very easy for someone to fall into it. So it'll have, something like part of a security measure. We noticed, something wrong with your account. Please follow this, or we need additional information from you, log into your account. And there'll be a link there. And you can see, if you hover over the link, you might see that it's, tinyurl.com and it with something after it. That's called a link shortener, right? So even that obfuscates where you're actually going. But, even that might not be enough for you to say, well, maybe that's just what Bank of America is, that's what the link is. Now, typically with these, if you were to click on this, it would take you to a website that looked so very much like the Bank of America website, that if you didn't really dig into it before you logged in, you would put your username and password in and it would log you in, and they would have it captured. Now, what happens after that is, after you go to the fake website and put in your credentials and, you hit sign in, a lot of times what they do is actually kick you to the legitimate login screen of, let's say Bank of America in this instance. So, you might not even know that you got compromised. You just hit sign in and the page loaded and it brought you back to the sign in page. You might be tempted to think, oh, well, I just typed in my password wrong or something like that. You can go type it in again, you log in, you don't really see anything that you need to do, and you close it out. You might not think about it. Another one of these is something like, UPS package delivery, unable to send you your unable to deliver the package sent to you. Please fill this out and bring it to your nearest UPS office. That's something that we've seen people fall for before as well. And this is another one. This is another really common one. So something like, hi, are you in the office? I need you to find out if we still have time to pay for an invoice, pay an invoice out today. With these sorts of attacks, what we're seeing mostly is it looks like it's from a high-level employee at a company. Like it might be from a CFO to the controller, or it might be, from, typically it's from someone high in the organization to somebody who has access to the money or some money. And they'll do things like, I need to figure out if we can pay this invoice. Oh, we need to do a wire transfer. We're behind on something. We need to, I need you to buy this or that and provide me the information. And, in a lot of organizations, your best cybersecurity still isn't going to protect against this sort of thing if the email gets through. If it's common for a CEO to ask or a CFO to ask for wire transfers to be done or money to be moved around or something like that, an employee might not really question it. They'll email back and forth with the supposed executive. And a lot of times we've seen some pretty significant sums of money, that have happened because of this. I mean, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes from these types of attacks. So that's my that's all the that's some of the bad stuff that's out there. We've got that out of the way, and I know some of it's pretty doom and gloom. Emotet, it's extremely hard to defend against, and all these things are out there. Now we're going to talk about what can we do to protect ourselves. And unsurprisingly, the answer is there is no single thing you can do. It has to be a multi-layered approach to security. You need different defenses in different places to defend against different things, to limit the spread of malware, and to stop it from penetrating too deeply, right? The days of, well, we've got, a $60, yeah, it, a $60 a year, antivirus and something like that will be fine. We're really way past that. Antivirus is just not good enough. Like back on the ransomware slide, 77% of the businesses that were hit were running up to date AV. Yeah, and Randy Wood, said it can easily be done on mobile devices, because you're in a hurry. Everyone's in a hurry. People are busy, and especially on mobile devices, things can really go through easy. Talking about social engineering, so let's get into this multi-layered approach. So the first thing is something that probably most people are familiar with: a firewall, right? So it's that box that sits at your company, and if you're a small company, maybe it's not really a firewall. Maybe it's some wireless router that you picked up at Walmart or Best Buy or something like that. But we're talking about next generation firewalls. So what is that? Well, first, let's talk, standard firewalls. A standard firewall controls what traffic can go where. And it does that by looking at where it came from and where it's going. And there's just a list of rules that say, yes, if you're coming from here, you can go there, or no, if you're coming from here, you can't go there. And that's, that sort of worked for a long time. That was the way people did it. But now with these next generation firewalls, what security professionals are able to do are turn on features and do things like intrusion detection and prevention. So intrusion detection and prevention, in a nutshell, basically what it does is it looks at traffic, and it looks at things that are happening, and it looks at web traffic, connections, and what it does is it looks for traffic that matches known attacks, known exploits, things that wouldn't normally happen on web traffic. It actually looks at that web traffic and figures out, is somebody trying to break into our systems? And it not only detects that, but then can automatically prevent it from happening by killing that connection, blocking that IP address, that attacker, that sort of thing. They also bring in application control. So application control is an extremely powerful tool that is in these next generation firewalls. So it can, what it'll do is it doesn't just look at the web traffic. It actually fingerprints and identifies what that application is, and then it can categorize that application into, less risky, more risky, not allowed, whatever. And then security professionals can then set rules that say, risky applications aren't allowed to be run on this network. They can't get out, but these less risky ones are able to. They also include web content filtering. So, what kind of content can you look at? Not just where you can go, but really digging into what is on that website. Are there specific parts of the website that should be allowed or should not be categorized? A categorized type of web blocking and filtering as well. So you can allow all business applications, but business websites, but maybe block all known malicious or unknown websites, right? If you want to be really safe. And then finally, sandboxing. So because there's so many different strains of malware, there's so many different attackers. I mean, literally tens of thousands a day. It's not possible for any one appliance like a firewall to know if something is good or bad all the time. And so what these next generations firewall employ is a sandboxing technology where if it's unknown, it will put it into a virtual environment and quote unquote detonate it and see what it does. And if it's malicious, great, it's stopped an attack. And if it's legitimate, then it just moves on through and categorizes that and knows that for the future. Now, we also need to think about next generation endpoint protection. So, your firewall can protect your networks, but you need that multi-layered approach, because what if the firewall fails and something gets to your computers, your servers, that sort of thing. So what next generation endpoint protection is really trying to do is detect and prevent malware, also detect and block unknown threats, analyze them, and respond to them in real time. So it has many different things, next generation endpoint protection can do to detect and prevent malware. Now, one of the things it does is the classic antivirus signature list, right? So every piece of malware has like a thumbprint that's called a signature that identifies it. And traditional antivirus clients download that big list every day, and then they scan your computer. And if they find any files that match on that list, then it blocks it. And that's just one piece of what a next generation endpoint protection will do. Yes, it will use that because it's a tried and true method, and it generally works pretty well. But because there's so many new threats, you need something that can actually detect malicious behavior from unknown threats. And there's many different ways that they can do this, but a lot of them are using artificial intelligence and machine learning to not just scan files, but look at processes, look and see what they're doing. What is this process doing? Is it similar to a known malware? What computers is it reaching out to on the network? Does this computer normally reach out to those? And it takes all that and determines whether or not something's malicious, even if it's never been seen before. And that's really needed, because a lot of malware, if it's just tweaked just a little bit to traditional antiviruses, it's an unknown, never before seen type of malware. Another piece that these next generation endpoint protection technologies bring to you is analysis. So, it's good if something gets blocked, right? Something a virus gets blocked, and that's great. But how did it get in? What was the root cause of it? What did it do while it was on the computer? That's where moving to a next gen endpoint protection can really fill in the gaps, as far as, okay, it came in at this time, it touched these many, all these different files, it tried to reach out to these different websites, and that can really help you find the holes in your security system and patch them up. And then automatic response. We want our endpoint technology to really take these responses for us. If it's 2:30 in the morning and something happens, and you don't have a 24-hour security operations center with someone really on the ball, those kinds of things can be devastating. So you need something that can really respond to threats automatically. User training. Users are the largest attack surface. There's a bunch of users in an organization with different levels of training and knowledge. And they can be a really big attack surface. So they've really got to be trained to spot these kind of attacks. You know, knowing that clicking on links can lead to attacks, data breaches, fraud, and really making sure that they know a part of cybersecurity is your responsibility as well. And when user training is done effectively, it flips the script on users being the largest attack surface and actually turns them into another layer of defense. And that's a key piece that a lot of places miss, is they think, okay, well, we can just solve all our security problems with technology. And that's really not the case. You need the human element, and your end users, you know, the people with computers, those can be a big help or they can be your biggest weakness. And then email protection. That's, you know, like we said, ransomware, Emotet, social engineering, a lot of this originates through email. So you need an email protection system that can scan for malware and attachments, protect users when they click on the links, to actually scan that website before it lets them through. It can block those imposter attempts where it might be a CFO emailing an employee asking for something, you know, block those kinds of attempts, and also a sandbox to run unknown threats in. So just a quick review, you know, our biggest threats and what we talked about here is ransomware, banking Trojans, supply chain attacks, social engineering, and some of our best responses are next-gen firewalls and AV, email protection, and really, really user training is absolutely key. So I appreciate everyone staying and listening. I'll open it up for some Q&A.
Well, first of all, thank you for that presentation. Excuse me, that was great, Alex. I appreciate it. So if you have a question for Alex, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. If you'd prefer to drop that question in the chat box, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Not everybody all at once. Alex, I think that's an indication that you did a really good job with your presentation.
Well, hey, I appreciate it. And everyone here, you know, if you have any further questions, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can, you know, you can hit up our website and get in contact with us. We've got really great products that we've put together, Fort Knox secure around all these solutions that we've talked about. And it's something that we're really passionate about. And I love talking to people about it. So please, you know, come to TeleComp, you know, come, or, you know, come to me directly, and I'd love to answer any more questions. And I really appreciate everyone jumping on.
And if it's okay with you, Alex, I will actually copy you in a follow-up email to everybody that signed up. What I'll do is I'll provide the recording of this presentation when I send out the email, and copy you in case they want to reach out to you, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for participating today. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and have a great afternoon.